There are, inshallah, our intention today is to move on from ayah number 5 onwards, but there are a couple of comments from the 4th ayah that I wanted to share with everyone that I think are very important. The first of them is about the sequence of the things Allah mentions in that ayah. There are 3 pieces. وَالَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِمَا أُنزِلَ إِلَيْكَ, and those who believe in what was sent down to you. That's a reference to the Quran. وَمَا أُنزِلَ مِن قَبْلِكَ, and what was sent down much before you, and that's a reference to Tawrat and Injil and Zabur, previous scripture. وَبِالْآخِرَةِ هُمْ يُوقِنُونَ, and then finally the only next thing mentioned is, and in the afterlife they have absolute conviction. There are actually 3 points, not 2, that are very important to mention. If this was going chronologically, first came the earliest scripture, then came the final scripture, then comes the afterlife. So chronologically you would have had وَالَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِمَا أُنزِلَ مِن قَبْلِكَ وَمَا أُنزِلَ إِلَيْكَ وَبِالْآخِرَةِ هُمْ يُوقِنُونَ. That would be a chronological sequence. But Allah Azza wa Jal purposely broke the chronological sequence, mentioned the last revelation first, earlier revelation, so He goes back into history in وَمَا أُنزِلَ مِن قَبْلِكَ, and then goes back to the future with وَبِالْآخِرَةِ هُمْ يُوقِنُونَ. So you notice that He broke that sequence, right? Now this serves an important function. This is something you have to keep an eye on when you study Quran. Sometimes Allah will put in order, and everything is in order except one thing is pulled out. So in this case actually, Quran has been pulled out of sequence, and Quran has been put first. Otherwise everything else is in order. But Quran has been taken from the middle actually to the very beginning. And this suggests something. It suggests that even though, let's say somebody in Medina used to be Jewish, or they used to be Christian, and then they became Muslim later on, obviously their first iman was not in the Quran. Their first iman was in what? It was in Tawrat, it was in Injil. That's what they believed before. The Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, the Gospel, given to Jesus. This is what they believed in. And then came along their belief in the Quran. Now the thing is, the thing you believe in first, or your early exposure, it's kind of like glasses you're wearing, and it sets the tone for everything else you're exposed to, right? So you see through that lens. For instance, those of you that are raised as Muslims, and you learn some things from your parents, consciously or subconsciously, those are a part of your Islam. And everything else you learn about Islam, you build on top of what you already kind of know. You don't question it. Like most of you, if not any of you, you've never looked up why you pray 3 rak'ah for Maghrib. You just do it. Your parents taught you how to do that, and you kept doing it, and now you've never looked up what's the dalil for 3 rak'ah in Maghrib. And why are we silent in the 3rd rak'ah? You don't look this up. It's just part of your religious consciousness, and the tradition moves forward. Now the same thing with our books. These people who believed in Tawrat and Injil, you would imagine that their religious affiliation, their connection to Allah is first based on what foundation? Tawrat and Injil. And then comes the Quran. But Allah Azza wa Jal breaks even the subconscious sequence and says, no, now you cannot look at your experience with Tawrat and Injil as primary. You must learn to rethink everything from what? The Quran. And instead of looking at the Quran in light of the Bible, you will look at the Bible in light of the Quran. So the Quran will actually come first, even though chronologically it's last. It'll now come first, and it will determine what you will accept or reject from the previous scripture. You understand? So it put the Quran in this, what Allah Azza wa Jal himself calls muhaiminan alayhi, a guardian, a watcher over the other scripture. It watches over the other scripture. So you're going to read, like if you study the Hebrew Bible now, I don't recommend it if you don't have background, but if you do study the Hebrew Bible, you'll notice, you'll read a lot of things about Musa, Moses, or Abraham, Ibrahim alayhi salam, or Isaac, or even Jesus in the New Testament. You'll read things that you just cannot accept. You just can't accept them. They'll say things about those same prophets that we love and believe in, and you will imagine they must be talking about somebody else. Because the kinds of horrible things that have been said, for instance about Nuh alayhi salam, you can't even imagine for a terrible human being, and they're casually said about them. So the amount of changes that have been made are so horrible, and there's so many, on so many fronts. And the biggest of those changes I mentioned yesterday. The biggest of those changes is Akhirah is almost completely removed. One of the most fundamental pieces of our faith, the afterlife, what is going to happen to a human being after they die, is gone from the equation almost entirely. Almost entirely. And so what does Allah say? Now you will look at Quran, and in its light you will accept or reject what you find in what was revealed before you, and then as a result your conviction in the afterlife will become strong. Otherwise, if you rearrange the sequence, you know what happens? What happens is, well, the old scripture, it didn't talk about the Day of Judgment so much. Even actually somebody emailed me yesterday after listening to this lecture online and said they asked a Jewish friend of theirs, a very conservative Jewish friend, do you believe in the afterlife? And they told them straightforward, actually, it's not a big deal in our religion. We just focus on making this world a better place. That's a flat out answer. And then yet others emailed and said, we've asked our Jewish friends and even rabbis all the time, do you believe in an afterlife? And the most common answer we get is, we're not sure. That's the common answer even today among Orthodox Judaism. Can you imagine? And so if you were to put that first and then come to the Quran, then you'll get the kinds of rhetoric that you find among some modern academics who say, well, the Quran must have invented this story about an afterlife because it's really not an emphasis of the Bible, because for Orientalists and Western academics that study the Quran, to them it's not munazzal min Allah, it's not revelation. It's a byproduct and plagiarized from the Bible and the Old, the New Testament and the Old Testament, and it's bits and pieces of things. So they say, well, the creative thing in the Quran is this afterlife business. So we got to find some other references that can justify how the Quran came up with this stuff. But that's because they're looking at the Quran as secondary, and they're looking at all what came before it as primary. Allah reverses that from the very beginning. Your study of the Quran must put Quran first and every other scripture second. And this actually determines something very powerful. We are not to look at the Bible, the Old Testament, the stories in the Torah and the stories in the Injil, for example, and the rulings found in them, whatever's left of them. Whatever's left of them. It is, by the way, still of value. It's still valuable. And it's still something of benefit for those who are going to study comparative religion, for example. And it's also important to understand, like I was telling you in my first session, when the Quran came, it was talking to rabbis. It was talking to priests. And those people have a certain mindset already. So it's important to understand what was in their head when Quran spoke to them. If I understand that you have a certain kind of background, then I will speak to you at your level. You understand? So Allah Azza wa Jalla spoke to them knowing what they know in the past, in the history. So it's important to compare how the Bible talked about the story of, one thing, David and Goliath, for example, famous story in the Bible. Later on in Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah will talk about it. So when we get to that, we will actually compare how the Bible talks about it and how the Quran corrected it. Not that the Quran, we're going to learn details about the Quran from the Bible, but rather the parts of the Bible will be proven true by the Quran. And some of the details that go along with the Quran we're able to accept. Okay? So this is actually the approach to the relationship between these two scriptures. That was an important thing to mention.